It did not go away. It's still clicking. So I tried aligning the inputs and outputs on the transfer case. I tried replacing the drive shafts, but I never could get rid of the clicking. So since I couldn't get rid of the clicking, I pulled the case off again and looked at the 3-gear area. And one thing that I noticed, and I'll put a picture up, is this is cleaned up now, but in this area of the bearing pocket from the main shaft into the transfer, I guess the 3-gear transfer inputs and outputs, it was clear that this gear, where the pocket is for the pin, this surface right here, which should normally be touching off kind of on a bearing race in the same way that the inputs and outputs do, instead it just rides on the pin. And then if there's excessive in play in this shaft, this surface here was actually contacting the transmission housing, and you can see where it basically machined a pocket or a groove into the face of the plastic, and that's where all the debris in the photo came from. And so what's happening is this shaft has too much in play in it. So, you know, based on tolerance stack of where it's being captured, and I'll open this up and show it in a second, but what you have is too much movement of this shaft. So it's probably hard to see. So what you get is when you put this on here, there's probably easy to see with that gear on there. So just demonstrating, again, there's the in play. I didn't bother putting it on something and measuring it because obviously it's excessive. So when it's pulled back, everything's good. You should be able to hear no contact. But what happens is under a load probably has to do with the parallelism of the shafts or whatever. They're straight cut gears, but it's driving this gear that direction, and it ends up dragging on that surface inside the case. So here it sounds like this. So what that is, it's actually picked up plastic right there. You can see it right there too. So that's from this gear touching the case. So I'll open this up and show you what my first thought was, eliminating it by shimming the shaft inside. But what I found is, because of the direction of the pin on that secondary gear in here, you can't do that because it'll still allow play. And I'll show you what I'm talking about. So the in play of this shaft, this one, is controlled by this face and where the pin is located, because nothing else holds this in place, right? The other problem here is that, so even if I shim to where there's no clearance between the inner race of this bearing, because that's one thing that happens, right? There's a couple of things that are happening in this transmission that are leading to this excessive in play. So right there, I can see that shaft moves up and down. If I stack shims on there, all it'll do is, if there's excessive clearance between the face of this gear, you know, when this all stacks up together, the clearance between the end of the long spacer and the inner race of this bearing, if there's still clearance there, whatever that clearance is, when you push on this, all it's going to do is make that bearing come out of that pocket by that much. And so that was one of the things I found. So, and the reason for that is because where this pin is captured here. So let's say I do all that. I hold this gear in place, which is essentially what using a shim, having this touch the bearing, you know, all this stuff stacking up this direction. Even if I hold this bearing in place, which is essentially what difference of stacking shims in here to take up the clearance, it'll still move that much. See that? There, sorry. And the reason it can is because what's actually happening is that pin is moving inside the gear that direction, away from where we're trying to control that clearance. So the way we can control that and make sure that this bearing stays in the pocket is shim this to where we minimize the clearance between the pin and the inner race of the bearing. Sorry. So we can minimize that by shimming between the inner bearing race and this pin, which will take up all the clearance here, and it'll make sure this pin doesn't come in contact with this surface. And then to take up the rest of the slack that we've got here, we're going to control this gear by adding another shim between the spacer and the gear. What that'll do is, let me get this out of here, this pin out so I can pull the shaft. It's got a nice raised lip here that engages the inner race of the bearing that comes out of the pocket if you just hold it with the pin on this side. One way that I got to this was just dummy fitting this together. So I'll give you an example. This is without the shim. Okay, so there's that clearance that we're talking about. So I know that I can take 4 of these HPI shims, which are, they're 5x8 by about 1/4 millimeter. So I can take, I know this is the stack that I need because that's what I ended up using ultimately. So those go right down in there, in that bearing pocket. They sit against the inner race, and then they take up all that clearance between the inner race and that hole for the pin. But I'll show you what happens if you don't shim that counter shaft on the other side. Okay, so this guy's super happy now. That pin doesn't touch the plastic, except if I push this, that little click that you hear is actually the bearing shifting and coming out of the pocket, and that's due to the excessive clearance that's on this side. There it went. See that? So in that area, that pin is still going to touch, and this gear is still going to drag. You can hear it. There we go. Again, that's that surface right there. You can see the debris that it's picked up from dragging on that boss right there. So I take it apart. And on this counter shaft, take this shim, which I just happen to have on hand. It's thinner, it's a 0.2 shim. You probably wouldn't want to use one of the Teflon shims, one of the Traxxas ones that are already in the gear case. That's what this is Arrma part number ARA 709057. I just happen to have these because I've got a bunch of Arrmas, so those are good. Those are used in the diffs, but in this case, it drops right down on that counter shaft between the gear and this spacer. And then I'm going to reassemble this. snugging these back up to show you it's nice and free still. I've got my shim stack there holding that pin up out of the way. So I can push on this and nothing happens. It's not going to push that bearing out because there's nowhere for it to go that direction inside the case. See if I can get this to move to show clearance. There it goes. Just that little bit of clearance. That's what we want. There we go. Again, zero grinding. There's no sound of this gear hitting the case anymore. And you can look, and there's no debris. So that's it. Button this thing back up, grease it, and it's good to go. I'll get another video of it running so you can have some side-by-side comparison of the clicking before and then the elimination of the clicking. So thanks for watching. I hope this is helpful to some of you guys like myself that have been trying to eliminate this clicking, and you know there's a reason for it, you just can't find it. I've seen things that are chips stuck in the root of the teeth in the gears. I've seen people say it's the phasing of the input versus the output shaft, or the phasing of the drive shafts. I did all that again and couldn't eliminate it, and then when I opened it up I saw exactly what the root of the problem was for me. Go ahead and like and subscribe, maybe put some comment or questions down below.